Hi, good morning, and welcome to this continuing series on the cosmology of light musings. And today in particular, we're going to continue the discussion on fourfold emergence in a cosmology of light. And the last time we met, we had gone into some fundamental emergences such as space-time energy gravity and the structure of quantum particles and the structure of atoms. And I think we had touched on also the molecular plans in cells, or perhaps that's where we stopped. But today, the idea is to get into what I'd call the post-human fourfold emergence, which really looks at things like thought, will, emotion, sensation, which again is a fourfoldness that is experienced by all humans. And then also getting into the culture component, knowledge, power, presence, harmony. And then also, if we get to it, the united world quadrality, which is also based on a division, if you will, by area of the world into knowledge, power, presence, harmony. But it's not like a geographical division in a sense. It's almost like these qualities show up as kernels of development in different countries, if you will. And that has a strong historical basis. But if we get to it, then we can discuss that in more detail. But let me step back and first talk about what really is the cosmology of light. And then I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask for a brief round of introductions, and then we can continue a little more deeply. So, what is the cosmology of light? And essentially, it's this view that based on the speed of light, there's practical realities that emerge that are correlated to that speed. So in a sense, we are very familiar scientifically with what we call this constant speed of light at c, or 186,000 miles per second, which in a sense animates our physical universe. That's the speed of light in vacuum. But it has some profound implications as to how we experience life. And starting with a very simple thought experiment, if we consider the light from the sun coming to the earth, we know it takes about 8.5 minutes to do that. So if we imagine that we're on a ray of light and halfway between the sun and the earth, then when we look back from this vantage point of being somewhere between the sun and the earth at minute 4.5, we see that 4.5 minutes ago, we were at the sun, and 4.5 minutes approximately in the future, we're going to be at the earth. And so it becomes apparent that the way that we're experiencing time, the notion of past, present, and future, is somehow related to the speed of light. And let me contrast that, because suppose, for instance, light were traveling infinitely fast, then everything would be connected by light instantaneously, so there wouldn't be a past, present, and future. But the fact that you have light traveling at a finite speed gives rise to this way in which we experience time. And so what we're saying from this simple thought experiment of how light is traveling, we can see this fundamental emergence of our way to experience time as a distinct past, present, and future. But also what's very fundamental in this, the way in which light is traveling, is that because it's traveling at a fixed speed and it's not going infinite, then whatever, suppose there is something that light needs to express, just hypothetically, it's going to take a finite amount of time for it to express it, because it's going to have to travel some distance to express whatever it wanted to. And this finite time, or this finite distance that it has to travel, I want to propose is fundamentally related to what we call, or what we term as quanta or Planck's constant. So this notion of energy or information reaching some threshold value before it can express itself or express whatever its secret is, that's this fourth thing that fundamentally is due to the way light is traveling. And so this thing that we call quanta, I also want to propose is fundamental to the way matter arises. So if we didn't have this quanta, suppose there wasn't a buildup of energy or information, then if there was something that was trying to express itself, it would immediately get dispersed. It wouldn't be able to collect itself. But the fact that it can collect itself in a packet is the foundation for the building up of matter in a sense. So we're seeing that four very fundamental things that we experience around us are, in this point of view, due to the way light is traveling. So again, the past, present, future, and matter. So there's this kind of fourfoldness. We're already glimpsing just intuitively that there's a fourfoldness that comes up due to the way light is traveling. And so just extrapolating in a cosmology of light, when we consider light moving at different speeds, there's different arrangements of fourfoldness that similarly occur. So when light's traveling infinitely fast, then if we consider a large volume or a large space, and if we have a light source at the center, then because it's traveling infinitely fast, it's going to fill up the whole volume instantaneously. And so we have then a property of omnipresence that rises up. So light is omnipresent in that space or volume. Since everything is connected in the nature of light, there's an implicit harmony. And so there's something that we may call omniharmony that also arises in that volume or space. And since this fabric of light exists everywhere, it has, in a sense, a knowledge of, or it can record everything that appears or disappears in its volume. And so there's something that we may call all knowledge or omniscience that also occurs in that space or volume where light is traveling infinitely fast. And then finally, if anything not of the nature of light arises, then light will overpower it sooner or later. So there's this property of all power or omnipotence. And so we can see kind of like a fourfold scheme arising as well when light's traveling infinitely fast. And just to summarize, it's this notion of omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, and omninurturance or omniharmony. And then in a cosmology of light, the one more point I'll make before I pause is that this emergence of fourfoldness, in fact, is tightly related. So no matter how you consider light to travel, how fast, but the way it shows up as this fourfoldness is a different face of the same fourfoldness. So when light travels at the finite speed of 186,000 miles per second and we experience past, present, future, and matter, it's actually a face of this omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omniharmony that we can hypothesize would occur when light's traveling infinitely fast. So it's just different faces of the same thing that's implicit in light. So that's kind of just the core idea of the cosmology of light. And I want to just pause there before we continue and just ask for, brief, let's go around and just a very brief round of introductions. And Margaret, perhaps we can start with you.
So I'm Margaret Faines. I'm a retired graphic designer and teacher. And I'm very much involved with Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's works. So I have this visual interest and I have this metaphysical, philosophical interest. And so in these two interests are very compatible with Praveer's work. And so I take the opportunity to, because it's, for me, what Praveer just shared is very contemplative. It's, it needs, as we were talking earlier, there's an assimilation time. And because it takes time, you have to give it that time. So that's why I'm here today, is to give it more time.
Thank you, Margaret. And
Hi, everyone. My name is Kiki, which is my nickname, but I've always been known by that name. So I'll just go along with the same. Kiki Bakshi. I live in Canada and I'm visiting El Cerrito these days. I've always been curious about Prabir's work, but have somehow not found the time that Margaret just spoke about, because it's serious material. It needs time and possible rereadings to really grasp the concepts that he so beautifully has laid out. I'm aware of the work, but never had the chance to go really deep. My interest is in psychology. After a bachelor's in psychology, I pursued the studies more and am trained in transpersonal psychotherapy. Along with that, I'm an English teacher. I teach English as a second. I have been teaching. I should correct myself because I'm retired now. So I requested Pravir to. He invited me, but I still thought that I might have nothing to contribute, and so was a bit shy and hesitant to join the sessions. But he encouraged me absolutely, and so this is why I'm here. Thank you, Pravir.
thank you both. Appreciate it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reshare the screen just to.
So when you were sharing the screen before, we saw your desktop, not the.
Oh,
okay, just so.
You see
Yes,
this?
now I do, but before it was not.
Okay. So, all right. So, what some of the readings for this one was the idea of the precision of cosmic computational power, and then, as I mentioned earlier, getting away from the pre-cellular, looking at this fourfold emergence, which just to summarize, when we discussed or when we looked at that, we looked at some cosmic parameters of the quadrality of space-time energy gravity that in a cosmology of light is a unified quadrality. So we can't think of space-time energy gravity as separate things, but they're actually one thing that explicitly bring forth this implicitness of this fourfold property that's in light. And again, what's a fourfold property? We roughly, when we did the thought experiment of light traveling infinitely fast, we came up with omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omniharmony, which we can call presence, power, knowledge, and harmony, just for simplicity. Those are four properties that are proposed to be at the heart of light. And so when we looked at the pre-human emergences, space-time energy gravity is nothing other than a face of the same presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And then we looked at the structure of quantum particles. And those quantum particles, of course, have technical terms, the quarks, bosons, Higgs bosons, leptons. But we also propose that that also is nothing other than a face of this fourfoldness of light. And so there's a tight mapping between the whole category of quantum particles and the properties we see inside light. And then also with the emergence of atoms, we saw that the way that all atoms are classified, categorized in the periodic table, we've got S shell, P shell, D shell, F shell atoms, that again is nothing other than a face of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. And then when we consider any living cell, we know that regardless of whether it's a human cell or plant cell or an animal cell, there's four molecular plans that animate it. And those molecular plans, of course, we call nucleic acids, polysaccharides, lipids, and proteins. But again, there's a one-to-one mapping with this idea of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And so we saw that there's this tight relationship. And when we talk about cosmic computational power, it's this idea that you've got these multiple layers of light that are all packed with different kinds of information that in fact, is the same information that appears in different form as light travels differently. But there's a precision in the arbitration of what shows up materially in our physical world that's correlated to the dynamics that are happening in these antecedent layers, because information or possibility or the richness or potentiality always wants to express itself materially, but only so much can express itself as the physical layer is ready to receive in a manner of speaking, right? So there's a computation that's going on that looks at, okay, what are we ready to manifest or materialize from all the possibility that lies behind in these layers of light. And so this computational process will, in fact, determine what can arise based on how things are changing at the material layer. So that's the idea of the cosmic computational power. But let me pause there and just see if there's any comments, any thoughts, any questions, and we can proceed. So I'm going to stop sharing for a sec, and then we can go back to the sharing in a minute.
So as you were talking about I guess it's called the more the atomic, the pre-cell, maybe?
Yeah, the pre-human, yeah.
Okay. So what came through for me was, I think we have a paradigm of interdimensional, at least folks who are working with meditation or maybe even in psychological terms of seeing something as like mental, emotional, physical. So I was saying, well, instead of looking at that vertically in that way, seeing a kind of that what's behind matter as, you know, it gave me a way of feeling about the layers, right?
Yeah.
And because that, to me, as you go through it, there's a bit of overwhelm because there's when you're talking about the precision, right? The computational precision. And then you say those levels and you think to yourself, the seeing precision at those levels is a bit of an overwhelm, right? Because I mean, just taking one, you know, just taking the atomic, and you're like, oh my God, you know, what manifests there behind that. So I think just starting to have an openness to experiencing that in some way, right?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, exactly.
it's starting. And, you know, like, because I'm doing some drawings of this work, I can sort of work with that going within behind, right? Or you could think of it going up behind vertically or horizontally, but still what's behind the materially and what's going into that, I think is kind of how I'm holding this part.
Yeah. And so I'll just mention that Margaret and I are collaborating on a book which is called Musings on Light, and Margaret is illustrating 50 pieces that I wrote related to the cosmology of light, and so it's an ongoing work, and I think it's been going on for Margaret, maybe what, 7, 8 months?
It's been since June.
Since June, okay.
And we're 2/3 through.
2/3 through, yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Of course, it's interesting that you mentioned, Kiki, that your background is in transpersonal psychology, because that's also, I have an MFT and was a therapist. So what it made me think of is that, you know, here we are both coming to this, maybe interested in the psychological implications, right?
Yeah.
And So, but there's this whole continuum before we get there of what's going on to create the psychological realities. So it takes, like you said, it just takes kind of letting the way we've been looking at things, relaxing that a little bit.
Exactly. And I loved what you said, Margaret. I loved your what shall I call it? It was much more than an interjection. It was your comment when
Yeah.
Prabir invited us to comment. I loved it because it kind of, it related to what I would have asked if I'd felt, I'm not sure if I was going to ask something, but you did it for me.
Oh,
So
that's great.
that's wonderful, because for me, I'm so deeply embedded in my own material from the transpersonal psychology point of view, that everything has to relate somehow. That's the way, I mean, those are the glasses I see the world, I look at the
Sure,
world. Yeah.
sure.
So I have to try and make, connect what Pravir is saying with some of that. And so I tend to get into my mind a bit. I start doing my own interpretation. And in fact, just these last few minutes have taught me something about me, which is to stop and listen. Stop your mind and listen. That's been very rich for me. Thank you, Pravir.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I so this idea of computational power. So what's being brought into material existence in a sense. So if we go back to the information that's contained in this layer where light travels infinitely fast, we call it roughly, it's all power, all presence, all harmony, all nurturance, or all knowledge. So that already get a sense that it's packed with infinite amount of information because it contains all possibilities of, in a sense, knowledge, all possibilities of harmony, but it's in a very subtle form. It's in a non-material form. And so when we look at the emergence materially of these layers, these very, if you will, thoughtful layers of the way matter arises, with quantum particles first, and then based on that atoms, and then based on that molecules, and then based on that molecular plans, and based on that cells, and then based on that entire systems of organs and so on, which creates all the diversity of life that we see emerge. One thing that I want to kind of draw attention to is that infinite potentiality of information with each subsequent layer that emerges, more of that is expressing itself. So in quantum particles, there's a limited amount of functionality or potentiality that can express itself because the medium of instrumentation is not as complex as when we look at human beings, for instance, which is much, much more complex. And so that fourfoldness is still manifesting as fourfoldness, but in larger and larger sets of what that each of those four properties means. So, if we think about the level of cells of any living cell, then we have there these four molecular plans, and within a human cell, we already know that there's, one of these molecular plans is proteins. But proteins, there's 30,000 different proteins or more that exist within the human cell. And so, if we look at the functionality of each of those proteins, they all exist for a very precise purpose. They're bringing out, or they're materializing some possibility or information that exists in that infinite layer of light. But the point being that in the human cell, there's much more of that potentiality, or that is showing itself as compared with, say, the layer of atoms, where you have, if we look at the thread of knowledge, knowledge as being one of the implicit properties of light, showing up at the level of quantum particles as this thing we call quarks. There's a finite number of what can express itself in quarks. There's a fixed number of quarks. The arrangement of quarks happens in a certain way. So knowledge can express itself in only so much of a way. But then as atoms arise, already if you look at the P-shell elements, which in this model is the counterpart of that thread of knowledge, you have a much larger set of atoms that expresses that same kind of thread of knowledge. And then the way those atoms combine gives you, again, a much larger possibility of how knowledge can express itself at that level. And then when you reach the human cell, then it's already multiplied drastically with 30,000 different proteins, for instance, which of course is the principle of service. But the principle of knowledge is the whole idea of DNA or nucleic acids, which we know is just, there's a tremendous amount that makes up the genome of different species and different individuals. And so we see that amplification of that same principle. So more of the potentiality of possibilities emerging very concretely. And then, as we know, no two human beings are alike. No two collectivities are alike, and there's so much more diversity in what can happen at the human level. But the point being is that it's, again, expressing more and more of that implicit potentiality that exists inside light itself, and that's becoming explicit as these materializations become more and more complex. And so that's the point being that with any subsequent layer of emergence, more of that fourfoldness can amplify what it really means.
So Pravir, one of the things that that I experience when you discuss, the layers behind the cell, and then, we're just starting to look at the human choice and collective. It's like being poised between this immense layers of buildup and the continuity that you're mentioning. That's the key for me, is the continuity, right? And then we haven't even gone to how that plays out in choice in humans and so forth, but it feels like this immense continuum in which what you're teaching me is that all those, the unity aspect and the fourfoldness in these discrete layers, I mean, how much information is in those, even before it gets to the cell, right? And then just because I know a little bit about the other end, it's like how much awareness to give that continuity behind matter, right? And how much awareness do you give to affecting what comes after the material? It's like, that's a really something to think about.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah.
And for me, Pravir,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just amazed at how effortlessly you go from the deepest of the layers and you just keep moving through everything, while I'm just visualizing somewhat the beginning of where you started, and I'm still trying to grasp it, but you so smoothly just go through all the layers, and from the atomic to everything else from there, and you just keep moving through it. I need to be on these calls a lot, is what I'm getting.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I say there's no downside, Kiki. There's no downside. I mean, the thing is, I'm just going to mention it very briefly. What we talked about in the beginning, as long as we can let go of what we know and not be reluctant or uncomfortable with that, open to something else, which, believe me, we all have our resistance, because I don't want to be stupid, or I want to be comfortable with what I have, whatever that is. That's why I think more people can come to these calls if they know that it's okay not to know.
Not to know. Thank you for that. Yes.
Yeah, because
Absolutely right.
believe me, you know, it's so easy to feel, well, what do I know about a Higgs boson?
Exactly.
What do
Exactly.
I, well, yes, you can know about a Higgs boson for sure, but what about seeing the fourfoldness? Even
Yeah.
if you don't know what he just mentioned about P shell, I know there's four, I'm not sure how they map, not to worry. Knowing that they map, knowing the fourfoldness is, I think that's the part we can kind of hold and let it flush out from there.
Yes.
Mhm.
I would agree. Thank you.
Does that feel right, Prabir, that we
Yeah,
can
it
let
does.
it flush out from
Absolutely.
there?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah, and you know, of course, you know, to your point, you know, of course, I spent literally thousands of hours in kind of just trying to map this stuff and contemplating it for years. You know, I mean, this has been a work that's been going on for a couple of decades. So it's, you know, so I've put a lot of time into just thinking through this stuff. And then the writing of those 10 books was really instrumental in trying to summarize or just make it more concrete, you know, more for myself than anybody else. And you know it's a very selfish process, you know, because it's I don't know how many people will actually read these mathematical books, but there was a great joy in actually putting it together only because things became more clearer for me.
Sure.
And that was the real gain for it, you know. So now what
Go ahead.
yes, I was just going to say. So now, you know, what I'm trying to do with these calls and other things, and working with, you know, people like Margaret, who can really make it, you know, much more you know, tangible, and you know, where other people can hopefully assimilate more of it, or just see what the epiphanies that occur to me, you know, perhaps other people can experience that as well. So that's the whole value of it.
So Pravir, I was thinking about another like model when of something that breaks through and has a very profound view that most of us have been very unconscious of. So I was thinking about the first time I even heard the word microbiome years ago, but not that long ago, right? Well, now it's like, what's all involved in that? And it's like a brain and how it influences the immune. So that's like one, you know, subset of a subset of a subset. And so you're talking about kind of cosmic microbiomes in a way, right? Because but what I'm saying is, what's the profound thing is, once the medical group discovered that there was all these properties of it influencing the whole function of the person, right? And that was completely below awareness before. And so what you're talking about is something, at least there's a similarity, right? There's a profoundness of influence and understanding functionality and arrangement with all this stuff that you're talking about, that most of us, like, we have not been taught to be aware of, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's very well said. Thank you, Margaret. You let me share the screen, and we can go into at least one of the
Please.
specific, because this is more, it's got more of a psychological angle
Yes.
to it, because we're getting into the whole human aspect here. So yeah, just let me know if the right screen shows up.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, you know, why don't we just spend a little bit of time on this post-cellular thought, will, emotion, sensation, human-based causality, and we can get into, you know, what that is a little more specifically. And I'll just scan through some of what's written in here. And of course, these paragraphs just summarizes what we already talked about, the pre-human stuff. And it's just showing the evident increase in materialized functionality as each subsequent quadrality emerges, starting with space-time, energy, gravity, and going forward. And the question really that I pose in this post is whether the human being is also a light-based quadrality. I mean, that is, so if you look back from a cosmology of light point of view, it makes sense that a human being should also be just a natural emergence on everything else that's layered before it. And based on this fourfoldness, that the human being should also be a light-based quadrality. And the point being made in this post is that, if we look at what drives or what makes up, in a sense, the psychology or the functionality that exists in this human being, we can break it up into the four properties that we saw in light: knowledge, power, harmony, presence. And how specifically? So if we think about a very key aspect of what we are as human beings, we have the ability of thought. And we can think in many different directions and we can conceptualize things, but that is nothing other in a sense than this thing that we're calling knowledge. It's a vehicle for discovering knowledge and for developing a more intimate relationship with the thing called knowledge. And so we already have that. It's part of what we are as human beings. And then similarly, if we look at the whole play of urges, desires, and wills, that in a sense is maps to this thing that we can call power. We're trying to express a power where we're trying to connect with everything around us in some way or something that we're interested in, but it's driven by this notion of having an urge or a desire or a will to step outside of how we experience ourselves to begin to connect to something different. So there's that's a play of power in a sense. And so again, it's implicit to who we are as human beings, the notion of urges, desires, and wills. And then we have feelings and emotions that is, in a sense, a play of the heart, or it's this instrumentation of harmony, because it's through that we can experience, can develop, can understand what harmony is. And so again, that's something that we implicitly feel or experience as a human being. And then sensations, which is, in a sense, the fourth category, is ties to all the senses that we have. And in this point of view, it's related to light's property of presence, because it's through the device of sensation that we become present to this idea of presence that exists all around us. And so, from this point of view, what we're saying is that if we look at the psychology of the human being, or if we look at how a human being is made, or what animates a human being, we're seeing these distinct sets of thought or urges and wills, or feelings and emotions, or sensations. And that has, again, this very deep mapping to the idea of this fourfoldness, which we call knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And so from this point of view, and as we know, each human being houses so much uniqueness and diversity. And so there's this fourfoldness that's implicit in light, the infinity of what's possible, beginning to make itself even more explicit with each individual being, right? So that's the idea. So we see that increase, the evident increase of the fourfoldness in light, just amplifying itself tremendously with the emergence of human beings. But let me just pause there.
So that has such a profound implication to me for yoga psychology or Indian thought, as well as, I mean, there are many, many systems, but it's so again, there's that fourfold expanded consciousness, if you will, and then the manifestation in the human of that fourfoldness. I mean, that ties into so much perennial wisdom, Pravir, right? I mean, it's not just that, but you know, there's a physicality to it. There's those four dimensions to it: mental, emotional. But it just it has a unitive quality too. I mean, I guess it's because I am a human that, you know, to see the fourfold so concretely in that system, in the body, in the mind, it ties, for me, it in a way, it ties it all together.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, these are just meant to, in a sense, kind of open us more to the mystery that always exists and how it expresses itself. But it's you know, just a starter in whatever else or however else we want to explore it. But you know, we're reaching the top of the hour, so I'm going to stop recording in just a minute here. So if there's anything else you'd like to say, then I'll put a stop recording it, and then we can just informally chat. So.
You've just given me a whole new way to look at everything. So, which is what Margaret's comments have been about, and a few things that I said too. But it's again, you know, opening your mind to another interpretation, another way of understanding. And of course, we are all the richer for it when we do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiki. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. So thank you both for contributing.